How do you make relationships work? What are the components that make a relationship work? What advice would you give to newlyweds who are getting married on how to handle their marriage? What do you tell your teenagers, or what did you tell your teenagers about conducting themselves in relationship with other people? How do relationships work? What should we do to make relationships grow? What should we avoid in order to protect the integrity of relationships? What keeps a relationship intact? Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about the idea of covenant, and covenant is the major theme. It is the most significant theme, particularly in the Old Testament, but we have them in both the Old and New Testament. In fact, the word testament itself is the Latin word for the word covenant. So we have an Old Covenant and a New Covenant, which marks our Scripture. God enters into relationship, and all of those relationships that God enters into are called covenants. Not all of them are marked by signs of covenants, but that's the sense of what a relationship with God is about. We've looked at the covenant of Noah a few weeks ago, the sign of which is the rainbow, reminding God of God's own self-limiting his options when it comes to wrath against creation and against humanity. Then last week we looked at the covenant with Abraham and Sarah. We looked how God had chosen a family to be God's own family in the world, a family that God had created pretty much ex nihilo, out of nothing, just like God created the whole creation out of nothing, meaning they were really too old to create anything out of, and yet God did some amazing things. And God chooses this people and makes a sign of covenant with them. In Abraham and Sarah's case, the sign of the covenant is circumcision. Today, we're going to look for a few moments at the covenant that Rick had just read to us from our first lesson, the Old Testament lesson. We call it the covenant with Moses, or the Sinai covenant, or the Decalogue, or perhaps you know it best of all, most commonly, as the Ten Commandments. You remember those Ten Commandments, right? Or do you remember the Ten Commandments? What do you think about them? There's been some controversy about the Ten Commandments, of course, and about whether or not they should be monumentally represented in government buildings. A 2004 Barna research poll indicated that 79% of Americans oppose the idea of removing displays of the Ten Commandments from government buildings, even though another survey found that fewer than 10% of Americans can identify 4 out of 10 commandments. Test your knowledge. And then look at the readings for today from Exodus chapter 20. Can you remember them? The commandments really work kind of in 3 directions. Though there's 10 of them, they really work kind of in 3 directions. How we relate to God, how we preserve life, and how we get along and live with other people. How do you see the Ten Commandments? Are they restrictive? Are they heavy-handed? Are they oppressive? Or are they liberating and life-giving? Most of us think of them as rules, kind of a list of no-nos, of things that we should not be doing, as codes of conduct. We often forget their relational context, which is a part of the start of our reading today. And because we forget the relational context, we make them into a set of rules rather than a conversation between God and God's people as to how they'll make their relationship work, how people can make their relationships work among one another. So my first point, Brennan's taking notes. The law begins with a word of relationship. And in our reading today, we hear God say this: I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. I am the Lord of God, your God, who did this for you, who ransomed you, who saved you, who acted on your behalf, who did good for you when you could not do good for yourself. So this covenant takes place with all this relationship already existing. God acts on behalf of the people. Now remember, God already has a covenant with this family through Abraham and Sarah. So this covenant isn't something new. It's not like God made a new relationship. It's almost like a renewed relationship, because God has relationship with the people of Abraham and Sarah, and these people in Egypt are the children of Abraham and Sarah. So this new covenant, or renewed covenant, if you will, through Moses, is really about how these new conditions are found within their relationship, and how God will begin to meet those covenantal relationship commitments with this people, and how they will love God in return. So you might think about this idea of covenant like a marriage. Some of us have been married. Some of us have been divorced. Some of us have been remarried again. Some of us here haven't been married yet, but maybe have thought a little bit about it. So in a marriage, you're going along fine for a while, right? But then maybe you hit a rough patch. Maybe your lives have changed. Maybe you went from sort of dinks, double income, no kids, and now suddenly you have a bunch of goslings, sort of a gaggle of goslings there that you have to take care of. And that changes your relationship, right? I mean, it's one thing to be a married couple and not have a lot of obligations. You're kind of free to do what you want to do. But then it's a different relationship when children come along. We begin to negotiate how we're going to do this relationship anew. And then, of course, it changes with various things. But when those geese take flight and leave the nest, there's a time for renegotiation of that relationship, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of like suddenly we find ourselves in a new kind of relationship. Though we're still related to the goslings, we're having ourselves a new kind of relationship with our primary spouse. And that marital relationship has to be renegotiated. Marriages and relationships are organic. They grow and develop, and they stymie, and sometimes they fail, and sometimes they die. And we can help them by helping to sort of socially grease the transitions that are natural to the development of any relationship. Sometimes we can do that quite easily, and the difficulty isn't that hard. We figure it out pretty easily, and sometimes we get stuck, right? Because we're not growing at the same pace. It'd be one thing if we were like a tree and we decided to grow all at the same time, and you could count the rings when the tree was done, and you figured out how it worked. But that's not how it works, is it? We're like two different trees kind of growing together, trying to figure it out in a neighborhood. And it's difficult to work those things through. Sometimes it requires a therapist or a clergy person to renegotiate the relationship. It may have been fine with traditional roles when you got married and you got children and figuring those things out, but now that children have come along, maybe we need to figure out how we're going to do these roles together now that the workload has increased. And so you begin to talk about how those things work out. And the renegotiation is how you're going to do things from here on out. And that's kind of the Ten Commandments. It's God's renegotiation of a covenant that God had made with Abraham and Sarah, and how they're going to work it out and how things are going to go from here on out. So they're relational in nature. You have to think about all of God's law commands as relational in nature. 2, these commandments are personal in nature. Notice the way in which they're written. If you look at Exodus 20, they're written in the first person singular. They're not written to everybody. They're not y'all. They're you. You. These words are given to you by your God. The law is a gift of God who has redeemed you. The Ten Commandments, then, are a gracious word of God, and they begin with a word of good news about what God has done on your behalf for you as a member of a community of faith. The commandments are to be read through the lens of a redemptive confession that you would make. I was lost. God found me. In this relationship, God begins to form a community. 3, most of them don't speak about consequences or judgments in whether we keep them or not. I don't suppose any of you on a daily basis pull out your wedding vows. Those of you that are married, you do that? You pull out the wedding vows. I here do solemnly swear. You don't review your marital covenant on a daily basis, do you? Maybe you never have reviewed your marriage covenant in that same way by pulling out the vows you made to each other on that contractual day in which you became one corporate entity with each other. But marriage has expectations, doesn't it? And breaking those vows with your spouse has real and painful consequences. So does breaking the covenant with God that God made with you at Mount Sinai after God freed you from enslavement. So the Ten Commandments list begins with a concern over preserving your relationship with God. There are to be no other gods. You're not to turn to other images in your time of need. You are to keep God's name sacred and protect it and honor it as you would honor the name of your beloved. The opening part of the Ten Commandments tells us to whom we belong, those first three commandments, if you will, and how this God has loved us from the very beginning, how this God has saved us all along and chose to love us, and how this God would ask us to love God in return. That's how the commandments start. 4. He's writing wildly. Don't write it all, just write the points. I'll give you a copy if you want to write it all. Or take shorthand. 4, while the address of the commandments is individual, skip that part, the concern is not for private welfare. One commentator summarized the Ten Commandments by saying this: the Ten Commandments, your neighbor's best life. Think about it. The Ten Commandments tells us what our vocation is, how we're to be in the world, how you and I are to be unique, and that uniqueness that contributes not just to private welfare, but to the welfare of your neighbor and to the welfare of all. There is concern over your own welfare, of course, in a couple of these commands about life, like Sabbath rest. Is it a good thing to rest? Of course it is. When Christine had her surgeries and neurologically in nature, what was the best prescription that they gave following the surgery? Sleep. It's the best way for the brain to renew itself. There is really no other way. Written into who we are as human beings is the idea of a pattern of work and rest and play, but that rest is essential for who we are. It restores us to ourselves. So taking care of our health by resting is a part of what God prescribes for our relationship for us. What a great gift, right? How many of you are workaholics? God says, no, take a break. I can never take a break. I can never get a break. I can never catch a break. And God writes into his understanding of relationship with God that you get one right from the beginning. A break all along. And there's concern for family ties. Honor your father and mother. It's the only commandment that has with a little caveat like this, that your days may be long upon the earth. No commentator really knows what that means, but if you're a parent, you understand. And you've probably said, I brought you into this world. Honor your father and mother that your days may be long upon the earth. I'm kidding about that. God does not put that in there. But God understands that the family ties, the connection in family, to honor father and mother, to honor family, is the strength of a people, right? I mean, in many ways, the strength of this church is the strength of communal and family tie. The strength of a community is the strength of communal and family tie, adding both social care but also stability in relationships. So the command to rest and to care for family are respect for the gift of life. That's the second part of the covenants. We're given to take care of, to manage, to steward. And the bulk of the rest of the commandments are how we get along with each other. How are those going? We're to honor life itself and not to take life needlessly. Thus, it says murder. We are to honor other people's covenants and protect their covenants' purity. We are to protect the property of other people. We are to live honorably and honestly so that society can be formed around such truth-telling and integrity. And we are to control our desires, coveting, so that the lusts that we have for others and for other things don't overcome us, and greed doesn't consume our hearts or the earth. If you look at your newspaper, you can pretty much apply almost any one of the list of 10 to any of the articles that are found there, because we've been working on these ever since the day that Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and sometimes we don't do a very good job of them, do we? I think the reason that we have in our set of lessons this morning, this idea of the cleansing of the temple, that was one of our graphics this morning, is the sense of Jesus' passion for what God's house is supposed to be about. In other words, the Ten Commandments are like that. What our lives are supposed to be about. They're supposed to orient us. They're supposed to give us a vista from which we see all of life. Jesus was shaped by his understanding of what the temple was there for. We as Christians are shaped by a love that's shaped like a cross, and it tells us a story about who we are to be and who God is. The people of God were shaped by God's vocation for them to be a particular type of people, to be a peculiar type of people and type of nation. Robert Withnow talks about how we transmit our ethical ideals to future generations, and we do that, he says, by telling stories. Stories, he writes, do more than keeping memories alive. Sometimes these stories become so implanted in our minds that they act back upon us directly and powerfully. Think about that. Sometimes these stories become so implanted in our minds that they act back upon us directly and powerfully. Withnow tells a story about Jack Casey. Jack Casey was a volunteer fireman and ambulance attendant who, as a child, had to have some of his teeth extracted with general anesthesia and was just petrified by that experience. But the nurse who was standing by him when he was about to go under by general anesthesia says, "Don't worry. I'll be right here beside you the whole time. When you go to sleep, I'm going to be right here beside you, and when you wake up, I'm going to be right here beside you." And when he woke up from surgery, the nurse's face was the first face he saw. It became a formative story for Jack Casey. This experience of being cared for by the nurse stayed with him. And nearly 20 years later, his ambulance crew was called to the scene of an accident. The driver was pinned upside down in a pickup truck, and Jack crawled inside the pickup truck to help get him out of the wreckage. Gasoline was dripping everywhere onto both the driver and to Jack. The whole time, the driver was crying out how scared he was of dying, and Jack kept saying to him, recalling what the nurse said so many years before, "Look, don't worry. I'm right here with you now. I'm going to be with you the whole time that we're here, and I'm going to be with you when we get out of here." Later, after the truck driver had been safely rescued, he was incredulous. "You're an idiot," he said to Jack. "You know that this thing could have exploded and we'd have both been burned up." In reply, Jack simply said he felt that he just couldn't leave him. That's how the commandments work. They are relational in nature. First comes the experience of being cared for. I am the Lord your God who saved you from enslavement in Egypt. This experience of being cared for or set free or preserved takes shape in the form of a narrative, of a story. Then there follows the life shaped ethically around a profound story. Do you have a profound story like that? Is the gospel that profound story for you that shapes who you are, that plays back into your life and profoundly leaves you a changed person? That nurse saying, "I'll be right here beside you. The last face you see when you go to sleep will be the first face you see when you wake up," profoundly shaped a man who would years later risk his life based upon that story. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the house of slavery prompts us to live lives shaped by the freedom created by this God. This story shapes us. These lists of no-nos, these lists of ethical imperatives becomes not an obligation, but a sense of freedom. These 10 commandments as declarations of freedom are far more satisfying than a list of 10 obligations, aren't they? Because oftentimes we face them as sort of dreary obligations. But if we see them for what they are, in light of God's saving action, it helps us to understand them as an invitation to the good life. And that's what I invite you to do today, is to think again about these list of 10 things that we're supposed to do or not do, and to see how they're an invitation for you to restore life, to live the good life, a relationship, a covenant that is worth keeping. Amen.